She was 93, fragile, slow, and just days away from being sent to a nursing home. But on the very morning they came to take her, she vanished. No goodbye, no note, just an empty bed and a lifetime of secrets. And when they finally found her, they realized something chilling. She didn't run away. She went back to the one place they could never take her from. She had lived through wars, loss, love, and change. 93 years of memories sat quietly behind her eyes, yet the thing that unsettled her the most was not the past, it was what was coming next. People around her spoke gently, carefully choosing their words as if softness could disguise the truth. They said it was for her safety, for her comfort, for her well-being. But every time she heard those words, something inside her tightened, because she understood what they really meant. They meant schedules instead of choices. They meant permission instead of independence. They meant being watched, managed, and slowly reduced to a routine. She had always been a woman who decided things for herself. Even in her younger years, when life was harder and choices were fewer, she carried a quiet strength. She chose how to spend her mornings, how to arrange her home, how to cook her meals just the way she liked. These weren't big, dramatic freedoms, but they were hers. And over time, those small decisions became the very fabric of who she was. Now, suddenly, those choices were slipping away, not because she wanted them to, but because others believed it was time. When her daughter spoke about the nursing home, she listened without interrupting. She nodded at the right moments, her expression calm, almost agreeable, but inside there was a storm building, not loud or chaotic, but deep and steady, like something that had been waiting for years. It wasn't anger at her daughter. She knew the concern came from love. That's what made it harder. Love, in this case, felt like a gentle hand pushing her somewhere she did not want to go. She remembered the last time she visited a place like that. The walls were too clean, the air too still. People sat in rows, staring at televisions or out of windows that didn't seem to lead anywhere. Conversations were brief, often forgotten halfway through. There was a strange quietness, not peaceful but empty. It wasn't the kind of place where life happened. It was the kind of place where time passed. And she had walked through those halls with a polite smile, but inside she had felt something close to fear. It wasn't fear of being alone. She had known loneliness before, and she had survived it. It wasn't fear of being taken care of. She understood her body wasn't as strong as it once was. What she feared was something harder to explain, the feeling of slowly disappearing while still being alive. The idea that her days would be planned by someone else, that her preferences would become suggestions instead of decisions, that her life would shrink into a schedule printed on a board. At home, even the smallest things mattered. The way sunlight entered her room in the morning, the familiar creak of the floorboards, the quiet moments when she could sit and think, uninterrupted. These weren't luxuries, they were pieces of her identity, and the thought of leaving them behind felt like losing parts of herself one by one. People assumed she feared change because of her age, but it wasn't change itself. It was the kind of change that erased rather than added. She noticed how conversations about her future happened around her, not with her. Decisions were discussed in lowered voices, as if she might not understand, or worse, as if her opinion might complicate things. That hurt more than she let on. After all those years of living, of learning, of making choices, she was now expected to simply accept what was decided for her. It felt like being quietly pushed out of her own life. At night, when everything was still, her thoughts became clearer. She would sit by the window, looking out into the darkness, and think about what she still wanted. Not big dreams or distant plans, just simple things. Waking up in a place that felt like hers, moving through her day without asking permission, holding on to the sense that she was still in some way in control of her own story. These thoughts didn't come with panic. They came with a quiet determination. She knew people would say she was being difficult, that she was refusing help, that she didn't understand what was best for her, but she understood more than they realized. She understood that safety without freedom can feel like a cage, that comfort without choice can feel empty, that living longer doesn't mean much if it doesn't still feel like living. Her fear wasn't dramatic or loud. It didn't show itself in arguments or tears. It was quieter than that. It was in the way she held onto her routines, in the way she asked small questions that others overlooked, in the way she hesitated when the topic came up, choosing her words carefully, knowing they might not change anything. It was a fear rooted in awareness, the awareness that once she stepped into that new life, there might be no going back. And yet beneath that fear there was also clarity, a steady understanding of what mattered to her. She didn't need everything to stay the same. She didn't expect life to be as it once was, but she wanted to hold onto something essential, the ability to choose, to decide, to feel like herself for as long as possible. That desire wasn't unreasonable. It was human. She thought about all the years she had spent taking care of others, making sacrifices, doing what was needed. She had followed rules, adapted to circumstances, and carried responsibilities without complaint. And now, at this stage of her life, when so much had already been given, she found herself facing a situation where she was expected to give up the one thing she had left, her independence. That realization didn't make her bitter. It made her resolute, quietly, deeply resolute, because for the first time in a long while she understood that this was a moment that mattered, not because it would change everything overnight, but because it would define how her remaining days would feel, whether they would belong to her or to someone else's idea of what was best. So while others saw a fragile woman nearing the end of her life, what they didn't see was the strength that still remained, the clarity, the will to hold on to something that couldn't be measured or easily explained. And as the days moved closer to that decision being finalized, something inside her settled. Not fear this time, but a quiet certainty that she wasn't ready to let go of herself just yet. There are some promises that don't fade with time. They don't weaken, don't blur, don't get lost in the noise of years passing by. Instead, they settle deep within a person, becoming part of how they think, how they feel, how they continue to move forward even when everything else has changed. For Alina, that promise wasn't something she spoke about often. In fact, most people around her didn't even know it existed. It lived quietly inside her, like a memory she protected, something too personal to explain to anyone who hadn't lived it with her. Long before the world became smaller and slower for her, there was a different life, a life filled with movement, laughter, and shared dreams. Back then, she wasn't the woman people saw now. She was strong, full of energy, with a kind of warmth that made people feel at ease around her. And in that version of her life, there was someone else, someone who didn't just understand her but saw her completely. His name was Daniel. They didn't have a perfect life. No one does. There were struggles, disagreements, moments where things felt uncertain, but what they had was real, built over time, strengthened by everything they went through together. He wasn't just her husband, he was her partner in the truest sense. The kind of person who didn't need long explanations to understand what she was thinking. The kind who noticed the small things, when she was tired, when she needed silence, when she needed someone to remind her that things would be okay. The cabin came into their lives during a time when everything else felt overwhelming. The world outside demanded too much, moved too fast, and left little room for quiet. So they found a place where none of that mattered. It wasn't grand or perfect. In fact, it was simple, almost unfinished when they first arrived. But that was part of its charm. It wasn't about what it was about what it could become. They built it together piece by piece, not just with wood and nails, but with time, effort, and intention. Every corner held a memory. Every small detail had a story behind it. The uneven shelf in the corner, the window that let in just the right amount of light, the chair that creaked slightly when you sat down. These weren't flaws. They were reminders of the life they were creating together. It became their place, not just somewhere they went to escape, but somewhere they went to feel like themselves, away from expectations, away from responsibilities, away from everything that tried to define them in ways that didn't feel right. In that cabin, they weren't roles or responsibilities. They were simply who they were. Time passed as it always does. Life outside the cabin continued, bringing new challenges, new routines, new responsibilities. They couldn't stay there forever, no matter how much they might have wanted to. But the cabin remained, quietly waiting, holding onto the version of them that existed within its walls. It became a symbol of something deeper, not just a place, but a feeling. A reminder that no matter how complicated life became, there was always somewhere they could return to. Then came the moment that changed everything. The kind of moment that doesn't ask for permission, doesn't give warnings, doesn't prepare you. It simply arrives and leaves you to figure out how to move forward afterward. Losing Daniel wasn't just losing a person. It was losing a part of her world, a part of her identity, a part of the life she had built with him. In the quiet that followed, the cabin became something else. It was no longer just a place of shared memories. It became a connection, a link to everything they had been together. And it was during one of those quiet moments, when the weight of everything felt almost too much to carry, that the promise was made. It wasn't dramatic. There were no grand gestures, no elaborate words, just a simple, honest understanding between two people who had spent a lifetime learning each other. He had told her that if life ever took him away first, she shouldn't let the world decide how she would live afterward, that she should return to the place that made her feel whole, that she should choose a life that still felt like hers, no matter how different things became. At the time, it might have sounded like something meant to comfort, something said in a moment of emotion, not necessarily meant to guide the future. But for Alina, it stayed. It settled deep within her, becoming something she carried forward, even when she didn't realize it consciously. Years passed. Life changed. The world around her moved on as it always does. People came and went, routines shifted, responsibilities faded. But that promise remained, quietly shaping the way she saw things. Even when she didn't think about it directly, it influenced her choices, her feelings, her understanding of what mattered. So when the conversation about the nursing home began, it didn't just feel like a practical decision. It felt like something more, like a crossroads between two very different paths, one that others believed was best for her, and one that she had known about for years, even if she hadn't fully acknowledged it until now. That's what made it so powerful. This wasn't a sudden idea, a reaction to fear or uncertainty. It was something that had been there all along, waiting for the moment when it would matter most. A promise that had quietly shaped her sense of self, her understanding of what it meant to truly live. The cabin wasn't just a location on a map. It was a part of her story, a place where she had been her most authentic self, where she had shared moments that defined who she was. Returning to it wasn't about escaping reality. It was about returning to something real, something that still held meaning, still held connection, still held a version of her that she didn't want to lose. And the promise itself wasn't just about going back to a place. It was about something deeper, about choosing a life that still felt like her own, about holding onto identity even when everything else tried to reshape it, about remembering that even at the end of a long life, there are still choices that matter. That's why, when the time came, the decision felt less like a risk and more like a fulfillment. Not something reckless or impulsive, but something inevitable. A quiet step towards something she had always known she would need to do, even if she hadn't known when or how. Because some promises don't need to be repeated to remain strong. They don't need reminders or reassurances. They live within a person, shaping them in ways that only become clear when the moment arrives. And when that moment finally comes, it doesn't feel like starting something new. It feels like returning to something that was always waiting. The morning she disappeared began like any other, quiet and ordinary in a way that made what followed feel even more unreal. There was no storm, no loud argument, no dramatic goodbye echoing through the house. Just the soft light of early morning filtering through the curtains, the faint ticking of a clock on the wall, and a stillness that no one questioned, at least not at first. It was the kind of calm that hides something beneath it, something waiting to be noticed. Margaret woke up with a plan already forming in her mind. There were things to organize, calls to make, arrangements to confirm. It wasn't easy, but she had convinced herself it was necessary. She told herself that once everything was settled, things would get better, more stable, more manageable. She held on to that belief because the alternative felt too uncertain. As she walked toward her mother's room, she rehearsed what she would say, how she would keep her voice gentle, how she would make the transition feel as smooth as possible. But the moment she opened the door, something felt wrong. The bed was empty. At first, it didn't register as unusual. Maybe she was in the kitchen. Maybe she had woken up early, as she often did. But there was something about the way the room looked that made Margaret pause. It was too neat, too still. The kind of stillness that didn't come from someone stepping out for a moment, but from someone leaving entirely. She stepped inside slowly, her eyes scanning the space. The closet door was slightly open. A few hangers were empty. The small suitcase that usually sat tucked away in the corner was gone. That's when the realization began to take shape, not all at once, but in pieces, each one heavier than the last. This wasn't a misunderstanding. This was intentional. "Mom," she called out, her voice uncertain, as if saying the word differently might change the answer. No response. She moved through the house quickly now, checking every room, every corner, as if there was still a chance this was all some kind of mistake. The kitchen was empty. The back door was closed but unlocked. The living room looked untouched. Everything was exactly as it should be, except for the one person who was supposed to be there. Panic doesn't always arrive loudly. Sometimes it creeps in, quiet and steady, tightening its grip with every passing second. Margaret felt it building inside her, turning confusion into fear. She reached for her phone, her hands unsteady, and dialed the number she hoped she wouldn't need. Within minutes, the house was no longer quiet. Voices filled the space, urgent and overlapping. Questions came one after another, each one demanding an answer she didn't have. When was the last time she was seen? Did she mention going somewhere? Was there anyone she might have contacted? Margaret tried to respond, but her thoughts felt scattered. She replayed the previous evening in her mind, searching for something she might have missed. A hint, a sign, anything that could explain what had happened. But there was nothing obvious. No argument, no refusal, no clear indication that this was coming. That was what made it so unsettling. She hadn't run away in a moment of emotion. She had planned this. As the hours passed, the search began to expand. Neighbors were asked if they had seen anything unusual. Nearby streets were checked. Places she used to visit were considered, one by one. Each possibility carried a small hope, quickly replaced by disappointment when it led nowhere. The authorities approached it logically. At her age, they said, she couldn't have gone far. That assumption shaped everything that followed. The search remained close, focused on the immediate area, based on the belief that her physical limitations would restrict her movement. But Margaret wasn't so sure. There was something about the way her mother had been acting in recent days, subtle, almost unnoticeable at the time, but clearer now in hindsight. The quietness, the way she listened more than she spoke, the way her answers felt measured, as if she was choosing her words carefully. It wasn't resistance in the usual sense. It was something deeper, something more deliberate. As the day stretched on, the initial urgency began to shift into something heavier. Fear took on a different shape, one that was harder to push aside. The possibilities became darker, more difficult to ignore. Every unanswered question added weight to the situation, turning
Heart touched? Like, share, and subscribe. What would you do? Comment below.
uncertainty into something almost unbearable. Friends and relatives arrived, each bringing their own concern, their own attempts to help. Some offered reassurance, others asked more questions, but none of it provided the clarity Margaret needed. She moved through it all in a daze, caught between hope and dread, trying to hold onto the idea that there was an explanation that didn't end in loss. What troubled her most wasn't just the disappearance itself, but what it suggested. This wasn't confusion. It wasn't an accident. It was a decision. And that realization carried a different kind of impact. It meant her mother hadn't just left, she had chosen to leave. That thought was difficult to face. Because if it was true, it meant there was something her mother wanted that she hadn't understood. As evening approached, the house felt different. The same walls, the same furniture, the same familiar spaces. But without her presence, everything felt incomplete. The silence had returned, but it wasn't the same quiet as before. It was heavier now, filled with unanswered questions and a growing sense of distance. Margaret sat in her mother's room, looking around at the things she had left behind. Small details stood out in ways they hadn't before. A book placed neatly on the bedside table. A pair of glasses folded carefully. Everything suggested thought, intention, awareness. This wasn't someone who had wandered off without knowing where she was going. This was someone who knew exactly what she was doing. That realization didn't bring comfort. It brought something else, a mix of confusion, frustration, and a quiet, unsettling understanding that this situation wasn't as simple as it first appeared. The search would continue. More places would be checked, more questions asked, more possibilities considered. But beneath all of that, there was a growing awareness that the answers might not be found in the usual ways. Because this wasn't just about finding someone who was lost. It was about understanding someone who had chosen to leave at first. The letters didn't seem like much. Just paper, aged at the edges, folded carefully as if they had been opened and closed many times over the years. Margaret held them in her hands with hesitation, unsure of what she was about to uncover. There was something deeply personal about them, something that made her feel like she was stepping into a part of her mother's life that had always existed just beyond her reach. She unfolded the first one slowly. The handwriting was familiar but different, stronger, steadier, carrying a kind of confidence that spoke of a younger time. As her eyes moved across the words, she realized these weren't just casual notes or passing thoughts. They were intentional. Each sentence carried weight, as if it had been written with the awareness that one day it would matter more than anything else. The words weren't complicated, but they were clear. They spoke of love, of memories, of moments that had shaped a life. But beneath all of that, there was something else, a quiet instruction woven gently into the lines, a message that wasn't meant to control or demand, but to guide. Margaret paused, her grip tightening slightly on the paper. She glanced at her mother, who sat quietly, watching her with a calm expression that didn't match the storm of emotions beginning to rise inside her. There was no urgency in her gaze, no pressure, just a quiet patience, as if she had been waiting for this moment for a long time. She returned her attention to the letter. It spoke of the cabin, not just as a place, but as something meaningful, something that held a part of who they had been together. It described moments Margaret had never heard about, simple days, shared laughter, the kind of memories that don't make their way into everyday conversations but remain deeply significant. Then the tone shifted. The words became more direct, more intentional. There was a recognition of what might come, of how life could change, of how time had a way of altering everything. And within that awareness there was a request. Not a demand, not an expectation, but something that felt just as powerful. A promise. Margaret felt a heaviness settle in her chest as she read it. This wasn't something written casually. This was something that had been thought through, something that carried meaning far beyond the moment it was written. It was a message from someone who understood that one day, choices would have to be made, choices that others might not understand. She reached for another letter, her movements slower now, more deliberate. Each one added another layer, another piece of a story she was only just beginning to see clearly. They weren't all the same. Some were lighter, filled with memories and reflections. Others carried a deeper tone, speaking of life, of change, of the importance of holding onto what truly mattered. And through all of them, there was a consistent thread. a quiet belief that life should be lived, not just maintained. Margaret's thoughts began to shift as she read. The confusion, the frustration, the sense of being left behind, it all started to take on a different shape. This wasn't about her mother rejecting help or acting out of fear. It wasn't about running away or avoiding reality. It was about something much more intentional. She looked up again, her eyes searching her mother's face for something she couldn't quite put into words. "You knew," she said softly, the realization settling in her voice. "You've known this whole time." Alina didn't respond immediately. She simply nodded, her expression unchanged, as if this moment had always been inevitable. Margaret looked back at the letters, her perspective shifting with each passing second. What she had seen as a sudden, alarming decision now began to feel like the final step in something that had been unfolding for years. A plan, not in the sense of careful calculations or rigid structure, but in the sense of understanding what mattered and holding on to it, quietly, patiently, until the moment came. The twist wasn't just in the letters themselves, but in what they revealed about everything that had happened. The disappearance, the silence, the distance, it wasn't chaos. It was clarity. It was a decision made not in panic, but in purpose. That realization changed everything. Margaret felt something shift inside her, something she hadn't expected. The urgency that had driven her, the need to fix the situation, to bring her mother back, to restore things to what they were supposed to be, it all began to lose its certainty. In its place, there was something more complicated, something harder to ignore. Understanding. It didn't come all at once. It wasn't simple or comfortable, but it was there, growing steadily as she connected the pieces. Her mother hadn't disappeared because she was lost. She had left because she knew exactly where she needed to be. The letters weren't just messages from the past. They were a bridge between what had been and what was now unfolding. They carried a voice that was no longer physically present, but still deeply influential. A voice that had shaped the decision being made in this moment. Margaret realized that what she had been trying to do, what she believed was right, was based on a perspective that didn't fully include her mother's understanding of her own life. She had been thinking in terms of safety, of practicality, of what made sense from the outside. But these letters revealed something else entirely. A different definition of what it meant to live well. One that wasn't centered on control or predictability, but on meaning, connection, and choice. She took a deep breath, her emotions settling into something quieter, more reflective. The situation hadn't become easier. If anything, it had become more complex, but it had also become clearer. This wasn't a problem to solve. It was a truth to accept. The twist wasn't just that her mother had planned this, or that the cabin held significance. It was that everything Margaret thought she understood about the situation was incomplete. The story she had been telling herself, that this was about fear, about resistance, about avoidance, wasn't accurate. This was about something much deeper. About a life that had been lived fully, and a desire to continue living it in a way that remained true to itself. Margaret folded the letters carefully, her movements mirroring the care with which they had been written. She placed them back in the box, not as something to be hidden away, but as something to be respected. When she looked at her mother again, she didn't see someone who had run away. She saw someone who had followed through on a promise, and in doing so, had revealed a truth that couldn't be ignored. For most of her life, Margaret believed love meant protection. It meant stepping in before things could go wrong, making decisions when someone else couldn't, and carrying responsibility even when it felt heavy. That belief had guided her through years of caring, through difficult conversations, through moments where she had to be strong even when she didn't feel like it. So when it came to her mother, that same instinct took over. She wasn't trying to control her, at least, that's what she told herself. She was trying to keep her safe. But standing there in the cabin, with the quiet hum of nature surrounding them, and the weight of everything she had just discovered settling into her thoughts, something began to shift. The version of love she had always relied on suddenly felt incomplete. Not wrong, but not whole either, because what she was facing now wasn't a situation that could be solved with protection alone. She looked around the cabin more carefully this time. It wasn't perfect. It wasn't designed for comfort in the way modern places were. It had its rough edges, its limitations, but there was something undeniable about it. A sense of presence, of meaning, of belonging. It didn't feel like a place someone had escaped to. It felt like a place someone had chosen. Her mother moved through the space slowly but confidently, as if every step was familiar, every corner known. There was no hesitation in her actions, no sign of uncertainty. That, more than anything, unsettled Margaret at first, because it challenged the image she had been holding onto, the idea that her mother was fragile, dependent, in need of constant guidance. She was. Not in the way Margaret had believed. There was a quiet strength in her, one that didn't need to be loud or forceful to be real. It showed in the way she carried herself, in the calmness of her voice, in the certainty behind her choices. And as Margaret watched her, she realized something that was both difficult and necessary to accept. Her mother didn't need to be saved. She needed to be understood. That realization didn't come with relief. It came with a kind of discomfort, the kind that forces you to question your own assumptions. Margaret had spent so much time believing she was doing the right thing that she hadn't fully considered whether it was the right thing for her mother. She had been acting out of love, yes, but also out of fear. Fear of something going wrong, fear of losing control, fear of making the wrong decision. And in trying to avoid those fears, she had overlooked something important. Her mother's voice. Not the literal voice, she had heard her speak, had listened to her words, but the deeper voice, the one that carried intention, meaning, and identity, the one that had been quietly expressing itself in ways Margaret hadn't fully recognized until now. Letting go of control wasn't easy. It went against everything she had practiced for years. It felt like stepping into uncertainty, like choosing not to act when action seemed necessary. There was a part of her that resisted it, that questioned whether this was the right decision, whether she would regret it later. But there was another part of her, quieter but steady, that understood something new. That love isn't always about preventing risk. Sometimes it's about respecting choice. She sat down across from her mother, the distance between them feeling different now, not as a barrier, but as a space where something honest could exist. "What if something happens?" she asked, her voice softer than before, less certain. Her mother didn't rush to answer. She considered the question, not dismissing it, not avoiding it. "Something will happen," she said gently. "That's life." The simplicity of the response caught Margaret off guard. It wasn't careless or dismissive. It was grounded, realistic. It didn't deny the risks, it accepted them. And that was what made it powerful. Margaret realized that she had been trying to create a version of safety that didn't truly exist. A version where everything was controlled, predictable, managed. But in doing so, she had been overlooking the fact that life had never worked that way. Not for her, not for her mother, not for anyone. Safety, in the way she had been imagining it, came with a cost. And that cost was freedom. She looked at her mother again, really looked this time, and saw not just who she was now, but everything she had been. The years of experience, the decisions made, the life lived fully and intentionally. This wasn't someone who needed to be shielded from the world. This was someone who had already faced it, navigated it, and earned the right to choose how she wanted to continue. That didn't mean it was easy to accept. It didn't mean the worry disappeared or the questions stopped. But it meant that those feelings could no longer be the only things guiding her actions. Love, she began to understand, wasn't just about holding on. It was also about knowing when to loosen your grip. Not to abandon, not to step away completely, but to create space. Space for the other person to exist as themselves, to make choices, to live in a way that feels true to who they are. That kind of love required trust. Not just trust in the other person, but trust in the relationship itself. Trust that connection wouldn't disappear just because control did. Trust that being present didn't have to mean being in charge. Margaret took a deep breath, feeling the weight of everything settle into something more stable. The situation hadn't become simple, but it had become clearer. "I don't want to lose you," she admitted, the words carrying more vulnerability than anything she had said before. Her mother's expression softened, but there was no sadness in it, only understanding. "You won't," she replied. And in that moment, Margaret realized something she hadn't considered before. Letting go didn't mean losing someone. It meant allowing them to be where they needed to be, while still choosing to remain part of their life in a different way. That realization didn't solve everything. It didn't remove the challenges or the uncertainties, but it changed the foundation of how she saw the situation. Instead of trying to bring her mother back to a place that felt safe to her, she began to consider how she could be part of the life her mother had chosen. How she could support without controlling, care without confining, stay connected without taking over. It was a different kind of responsibility, one that required more patience, more listening, more willingness to accept things she couldn't fully control. But it also felt more honest, more aligned with what her mother actually wanted. As the light outside shifted and the day moved forward, the tension that had once filled the space between them began to ease. Not because everything had been resolved, but because something fundamental had changed. Margaret wasn't trying to fix the situation anymore. She was trying to understand it. And in doing so, she discovered a version of love that was quieter, deeper, and far more difficult than the one she had known before. A love that didn't demand, didn't force, didn't decide. A love that listened, respected, and allowed. And in that space, something new began to form. Not a perfect solution, not a complete answer, but a connection that felt stronger precisely because it was no longer built on control. This story is a fictional narrative created for emotional and inspirational purposes. While it reflects real-life feelings and situations many families face, it is not intended as medical, legal, or caregiving advice. Every elderly person's needs are different. Always make decisions with proper guidance, care, and compassion.
Heart touched? Like, share, and subscribe. What would you do? Comment below.